You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
The Ring of Fire is a 5,000 square kilometer area of land in the James Bay lowlands of northern Ontario, located within Treaty 9 territory. The term Ring of Fire refers to multiple extremely large mineral deposits that include nickel, copper, cobalt, platinum, and chromite. Some deposits large enough to continue extraction for over 100 years. Developing the Ring of Fire would include not only building the mines themselves, a pretty big undertaking in a remote fly-in region of Ontario's far north, but also roads, hydroelectric and broadband infrastructure, as well as a proposed smelter in Sault Ste. Marie. Mining companies and the Ontario government are trying to frame the development of the Ring of Fire as the key to the future of low and zero-emission vehicles and transportation that will help us transition to a cleaner, more sustainable green economy. But climate justice activists and Indigenous people living in the region around the Ring of Fire, or along the Attawapiskat River downstream of the proposed mines, are telling a different story. In today's episode, I speak with Kate and Mike, two members of a grassroots coalition group called Friends of the Attawapiskat River, about the Ring of Fire and why we should be paying attention.
I'm from Attawapiskat First Nation. It's on the shores of James Bay. We have a provincial park just north of Attawapiskat, Polar Bear Provincial Park.
This is Mike.
We have it's about over 200 miles of Attawapiskat River. There's a lake. So I'm a family of 8. My mom, my dad are originally from Attawapiskat. My mom went to residential school. My dad continued his cultural activities, harvesting, continued living off the land till the day he passed. So that's where he was, mostly on the land. So I'm the 4th oldest siblings of 8. So I have children. I have about 2 children, and I have 3 stepsons from the first marriage. So 2 adopted. So I got about 7 children. So I'm currently separated. So I moved away from Attawapiskat to go look for a job. So I'm currently in Niskanjaga as a mental health worker. So I'm on a contract work. So I do a shift, we call it rotation, to come in to Niskanjaga. So I live in Thunder Bay right now.
What is the Ring of Fire and that proposed development?
De Beers found diamonds, a monopross company. They did the staking claims, did the drilling. So they found some kimberlites. So I guess that's what Ring of Fire did also years back. They state claims. They still own the claims just west of Wabascat, probably east of Webequie First Nation. The way they told when they discovered the resources over there, they claimed they found a deposit of nickel with the Eagle's Nest. And if they were to operate a mine, it would be last about 20 years or something. But with the chromium and for the Ring of Fire, the mine, they want to mine something from there to operate probably over 120 years.
What is life like in those First Nations communities in the area?
Well, for myself, out of Wampscut, I was born, raised, and it's a small community. The population's growing, and I guess we hunt and trapped in our traditional territories. We fished, we harvested fish, we hunt moose. Also waterfowl. We hunt in the fall time, even in spring. And like I know my parents, my dad hunt caribou, the migrating caribou, just north of Wabascat. So he did a lot of harvesting, maintaining his livelihood. So and with the impacts of the residential school, we see the intergenerational trauma and what's happening in our communities. Well, with my own, like observing, we had alcohol issues, we had violence in homes in the communities. There was a high rate also with suicide in each community. And now today's society, today's First Nations communities, we're lacking of housing, shortage of housing. The housing is backlogged, and we have schools in the community. Some people don't have high school. So when I was a teenager, I had to leave out of Wapsit to go to a high school in North Bay. So with the mine just in our Wapsit area, there was what they were worried about, the social economic impacts. So sure enough, there was high rate of prescription drug abuse that happens today. It's happening right now. It's not mostly alcohol; it's just drugs now. So I guess the lifestyle is different right now with our young people.
Could you maybe describe in a bit more detail what some of the impacts of mining that you've seen on those communities, like what has that looked like in your experience?
Well, when De Beers came for the diamond mine, they had to, when they dealt with what we call an impact benefit agreement, IBA, they dealt only with our Wapscut. And so we had an agreement with them. After a while, the other communities signed on with another benefit agreement with themselves, with De Beers, because they're traveling on their traditional territory. So with De Beers, we had employment rate according to De Beers. There was like 75% of Arawapskat First Nation members. But the members that were living off reserve was the high number. So they had the opportunity to come and work, which was good. So they developed experience, they got trained on stuff. And mostly the First Nations communities from Arawapskat did work, but not as much as they said it was the majority. We have, as First Nations, we have a band number, which we belong to Arawapskat. So that's where they keep track of who was Arawapskat band member working at the mine. So the IBA also, the agreement that they had to hire environmental monitors to look after the environment, to look after any spills, anything. And I guess they had to follow guidelines, strict guidelines, like not to damage or have environmental concerns to the land. And also, what happened was what we found out after is, well, before De Beers closed, there was a high level of mercury in the river system just downstream of Arwapskat River, where De Beers was. De Beers is about 90 kilometers from Arwapskat First Nation, the community itself. So I guess a wildland leaks sued De Beers for that incident, and I guess De Beers got caught for not reporting the proper or guidelines for what was going in that river. Remember, we had environmental monitors to look after whatever environment that they're working on. So people came, and like they had rotations 3 weeks in, 2 weeks in or 3 weeks in to work at the mine site. So people had good low paying, not high paying job. So we got the scraps working at mine. So, but people needed work, right, to live, provide.
Mining hasn't started, but there has been some exploration activity, like you mentioned earlier, with people staking claims. Can you maybe talk a bit about what that has looked like, and if you know what people have experienced from just the exploration phase?
Yeah, right now we have people go hunting in that area, moose hunting, traveling by boat, right? Even the winter time. I guess the airstrip over there where that mine's going to be, and I guess they found some drum cans, a drum, where they hold gas or fuel for jet or something, or diesel. So people found those items along their travels, doing their trap lines or harvesting moose. So they came across those stuff. So that's what I mean. They're supposed to look after their material, their equipment, and whatever's like. Seems like they're dumping their material on the land with that properly stored or taken off, take back to their site. So that's what people are mentioning, and that's a concern. Yeah, just going back with De Beers also, like there was a mine operated for 15 years, and like what I found out also is a lot of our hunters harvesting caribou are not traveling far, 10 hours. They just go in the woodlands about an hour, and they could take their quota, their harvest with caribou. It wasn't like that when the mine operated. So they had migrated woodland caribou. So that's what the local people, the hunters, noticed with the elders.
Could you talk a bit about what some of the impacts would be of the infrastructure for the mine they're talking about developing?
So it would be good if we get family in the surrounding communities. They'll go to school. Yeah, they'll have time to visit home, go back. That's one benefit for us. But the other one is, the other benefit would be like more housing, build housing, build infrastructure like new water treatment plants. We used to have underwater advisory, some of the First Nations communities, and still there's it's not safe to drink from the tap water because of our raw water system is not equipped or updated, or it's outdated. So the infrastructure would be good. To build a water plant would be half the price, the way they're asking now to build a new water treatment plant. So that would be the benefit. What I'm worried about with the negative impacts is the water. And we know what coronium is. We know what's going to do. So that's the concern I have, for one. Like, that's very cancerous material. So that's a worry. What if it travels underground? It will leach underground. So those are the concerns, the negative impacts that I'm worried about. But who's going to protect, help us? Who's going to monitor? By the time something leaches, something flows downriver, and it's not caught in time, those are the negative impacts.
Can you tell me what the consultation process has been like?
Well, the consultation itself, it's on hold. Everything's on hold, the consultation. With the COVID for the last 2 years. But the process itself for terms of reference with the government of Canada, we can't really participate because of the restrictions. And right now, that process, that consultation process, is still happening, but we can't be part of it. And there's a deadline. There's a deadline for us, February 1st deadline, that we have to submit a concern, environmental concern, or indigenous inherent rights concerns. We can't be part of that process. We can't deliver physically, locally concerned, like the concerns that we have with this mine. It's really restricted. Yes, we can submit something in writing, but is that enough? Or would that be enough?
I know the federal government has been talking a lot about reconciliation, a lot about residential schools, but also, I guess, saying a lot of stuff about having a different kind of relationship with Indigenous people on this territory. I guess I'm curious about how you see it with like the way that this project is happening. Does it feel different in terms of like how much control people have over what happens to their land, or how much sharing of the profits of those mines happens, or do you think that kind of changes the colonial relationship?
Reconciliation that they talked about, I don't see it. It's just like we're still fighting the government. These are basic inherent right, like our treaty rights. It's like they have their constitution, protection of First Nations also. They're under that constitution. But somehow, when we stand up, fight for our rights, our inherent rights, we still get in trouble just to protect that land, that water. You know, it says that the Section 35 of the Constitution, it says like it recognizes and affirms that Aboriginal treaty rights. But why are we going back talking about the reconciliation? We're still, dealing with the Indian Act. That's not reconciliation. Under the government, I'm a number 143. I belong to Arawapskat. That's the 143 reserve number. And 1360, that's my number, myself. I'm just a number with the federal government of Canada. And I still fall under the Indian Act. Even though I have inherent rights, even though I have treaty rights. The treaty says we're supposed to walk parallel. What they do, we do. What we do, they'll do it. So it seems like we're always violating our side of the treaty. Protecting that land seems like we're still fighting the government. Just look at the West Coast, the pipeline. That's unceded territory. And we have treaties with the federal government, and they talk about reconciliation. I don't see it. With the Treaty 1905, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, the water flows, and the wind blows. That's how that treaty is supposed to work. Side by side, parallel. But it seems like it's not like that. We again, it always seems like we have to remind them about our inherent rights, because the treaty also the rights that we signed. Don't forget, there was no chief or council members back then. It was the grassroots people that signed that treaty. So the grassroots people have a say on this project.
With the different chiefs and people on council, I guess both with the individual bands and with there's a larger group representing multiple nations. I guess how much is everyone on the same page or not on the same page about the Ring of Fire development going forward?
So as of right now, we have chief of councils. It's the colonial system where we have to decide who's going to run for the chief in the community. So mostly it's not fair sometimes who we pick. It's family-oriented, family-related, relation, or somehow, it's not good. It's not healthy. A lot of times you're supposed to represent the nation, the community, right? We're a nation. And also the tribal councils, they're for Mushkegowuk itself, it's a federally incorporated piece of paper. And they have no band membership status to their members. It's just people voting the Grand Chief, the Deputy Grand Chief in our territory in Mushkegowuk. And also, Mushkegowuk don't have a territory. They're just using what Arawapskat traditional lands are. So, going back with the treaty when it's signed, there was no chief. It was just headman of the traditional territory. It could be my last on this land. This is our traditional territory. We share that land. We don't own it, like I said. Whoever comes, we share. with the animals. We share with the harvesting. So 9 came to represent 49 communities because of the Treaty 9 that was signed. There was 49 communities. That's where 9 was developed. So I think it's a federal cooperated or provincial cooperation. So they represent the chiefs only in each community, and again, the membership are left out. The grassroots people are left out. We don't know what's going on at Nan territory. We don't know what's going on at Muskego tribal office. They get funding, they get program dollars, but a lot of times that program dollars doesn't fall into our communities.
Was there anything that you were hoping to talk about that I haven't asked you about yet?
Well, it's always a concern when there's a project, right? We started Friends of the Attawapiskat River. It's a grassroots group based in our area, Treaty 9 area. So it's just awareness that we have to let others know because they don't know what's really going on. Like I said, the consultation is there, the consultation process, but they don't come and talk to us directly in each community. So that's why we developed the grassroots movement, is let others know what's coming. And that there's a voice, at least there's a voice of Treaty 9 members, Treaty 9 committee, you know, at least somebody's saying something. Because those kids yet to be born, they're going to say, how come we didn't say anything? How come we didn't fight for, to protect the land, to protect the water? They're going to ask those questions. Why did we let it happen?
I wanted to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to chat with me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it also. I enjoyed the conversation. That's the point of view that I have to let people know in our area.
You're listening to From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM. Or you might be listening to the podcast version, available on all major platforms. In today's program, I'm speaking with two members of the Friends of the Attawapiskat River, a coalition group raising awareness about the Ring of Fire development in Northern Ontario.
I'm a member of a grassroots group based in Toronto called the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network.
And this is Kate.
Which is a group that's been around for almost a decade now, organizing in support with communities around the world who are impacted by Canadian mining projects, working to resist the influence that the Canadian mining industry has around the world, working to resist some of the discourse that they perpetuate that supports their work, which we have a lot of exposure to here in Toronto, which is, we kind of think of it as the belly of the beast of the Canadian mining industry. And I'm also a member of a coalition called the Friends of the Attawapiskat River, which has been organizing for the last little while around the Ring of Fire.
Could you give us an overview of the current state of the project? I guess basically, like, where are things at right now with the Ring of Fire?
One thing that's new that we still haven't really quite strategized around is that the major corporation that has been on the scene for a long time, like the one in the news, the one pushing things forward, has been a company called Noront Resources, which is a Toronto headquartered junior mining company, which just a few months ago was purchased by an Australian company called Wyloo Metals, which is a mineral company owned by this billionaire dude named Andrew Forrest. So we don't really know what that's going to mean for everything, but it's a relatively recent thing. But basically, this other than the corporate side of things, the current situation around the Ring of Fire is a whole bunch of environmental assessments are happening all at the same time. So when it comes to mining, kind of some parts of mining projects are the jurisdiction of Canada, and some parts are the jurisdiction of Ontario. And because of that, there's always been like two separate laws and two separate processes when it comes to environmental assessment. So there's provincial EAs, and then there's federal EAs, which are basically, for those who don't know, like processes that certain kinds of entities need to undergo to get approval to move forward with the development that they want to do. And through these processes, they have these requirements around consulting with stakeholders. Obviously, who is considered a relevant stakeholder is like a hotly contested thing in that. And they have to like prove that they've addressed stakeholders' concerns and then make a plan for how they're going to prevent or mitigate or clean up any environmental harms that are like associated with their project.
Today, we're taking a crucial step forward in unlocking the multi-billion-dollar opportunity that is in Northern Ontario's Ring of Fire. We're moving forward with a Northern Road Link, which is absolutely critical to connect the Ring of Fire to markets across the country and around the world. Our First Nations are our trusted partners on this groundbreaking project.
We're very grateful for the leadership, in particular, of the two communities that we stand shoulder to shoulder with today as signatories. It represents an opportunity for us to now more rightfully share in the prosperity and in the opportunity.
You just heard Premier Doug Ford and Greg Rickford, the Minister of Energy, Northern Development and Mines, and Minister of Indigenous Affairs, sounding quite pleased with themselves in early March 2020.
And so one of the things about the Ring of Fire that makes it such a complicated and risky endeavor is that like there's so much infrastructure needed in order to make their vision real. And one of the reasons for that is that all of the land that they want to mine is like fly in only. There's no roads. And the particular minerals that are being mined, they're too heavy to fly, like to be transported in airplanes. So the current plan, according to Noront Resources anyway, who knows what's going to happen with Wyloo, but the current plan is to build one mine in the Ring of Fire called the Eagle's Nest Mine, which after years of operation would then generate enough capital to fund a handful of chromite mines. And the chromite mines are like the jackpot mineral. Like this is the stuff that everybody's trying to get to. But in order to process the minerals from the chromite mines, we also need to build a mineral smelter in Sault Ste. Marie that can process that particular kind of substance. And in order to build the Eagle's Nest mine, we need all sorts of hydroelectric and internet infrastructure. And really importantly, they need roads. So there's stuff around, like obviously all that infrastructure needs money from the government. Hopefully, and I say hopefully, like the hope is coming from the company. But specifically, like all of that infrastructure means we need an environmental assessment conducted for the mine itself, for the smelter, for one road, and then also a second road. And that's at least 4 EAs, each of which can take years and like an incredible amount of community labor to participate in. And there's been a lot of people, a lot of leaderships from different First Nations in the area who have spoken out very publicly, kind of decrying the companies and the government for continuing to push forward these EAs in the middle of a pandemic. Because it's like, how can you meaningfully participate in these public consultations when not only are communities under boil water advisories and all of that stuff, but they're in a pandemic. So there's two environmental assessments happening right now on 2 separate roads that are being proposed. And then there's also a federal level assessment called a regional assessment that's underway. What's good and what's different about the federal assessment compared to provincial assessment. And I'm sorry, by the way, that this is also wonky. It's just like kind of what the situation is. What's good about the federal assessment is that unlike the provincial assessments that are treating each piece of this infrastructure like its own separate consultation process, The regional assessment is looking at the impacts of the whole thing altogether. So the mine, the roads, the smelter, the environmental impacts, the impacts on Indigenous sovereignty. And so that's good because it kind of, the idea is that it's like a more holistic view on the big picture, and people who are commenting can comment on the big picture instead of being asked like just about one road, even though the road is connected to the mine, which is connected to the smelter and yada, yada. So that's good. But what's bad about this regional assessment is that they just released the terms of reference for it, which is like the policy governing how the assessment is going to go down. And it sucks. The terms of reference places Indigenous people in like a purely advisory role, no real decision-making power. It also does weird things where it defines the geographic boundary of the assessment, like basically like what are we talking about when we talk about environmental impacts? It defines the geographic boundary according to the mineral deposit instead of according to the watershed, which creates an inherent bias in how we're understanding like what we're even talking about and what we're protecting. So because of that, and this is all very recent, like that was just released about a month ago. Right now, we have 2 petitions going, one for people in Treaty 9 and one for allies. Both of them are focused on trying to convince Minister Stephen Guilbeault and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, honestly, to just throw this terrible terms of reference in the garbage and to start fresh with an Indigenous-led process, which we don't know how that's going to go down. Minister Guilbeault is like kind of famously, he has a history as an activist. So, you know, just a different kind of person to try to get us to listen to as opposed to like a conservative dude or something. But that's the short-term focus right now is just, can we just go back to the table and try to find a way to understand the environmental impact that is actually led by the people who are going to have to live with the long-term impacts of these projects.
What are some of the narratives around our post-fossil fuel future and green technologies like electric vehicles that depend so heavily on mining of minerals, like the ones present in the Ring of Fire deposits? And yeah, what is important to challenge about those narratives?
Yeah, it's really big. And something that I think in the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, anyway, we're still spending a lot of our time wrapping our minds around, because like greenwashing isn't new. Like mining companies have always done greenwashing, and so has the government. But this thing around green technologies and minerals, it definitely feels new. And we've really seen a shift in the last year where the Ford government specifically has been just speaking much more clearly and publicly about their perception on the role that the Ring of Fire is going to play in preventing climate change. They're also like, oh, the Ring of Fire is going to help us recover economically from COVID. It's going to do all these things. It's going to save our economy. Like a lot of stuff in our words being placed in the basket of this thing. But recently Ford released this like mini budget that made all of these intentions really clear. That, yeah, electric vehicles, in order to have electric vehicles, we need these specific minerals that we find in places like the Ring of Fire, and electric vehicles are like the path to our salvation when it comes to climate change. And you'll see, I'm just obviously laughing as I say that because it's hilarious. And by hilarious, I mean horrible. And this like shift in the way that Ford is talking about this stuff is very much in line with a broader shift that we're seeing in the mining industry at large, where way more discourse about environmentalism than I've ever seen in my years of organizing around this industry. And I kind of see it as a bit of a scramble. Like the industry is just doing everything it can to escape this PR crisis as more and more people learn how violent and devastating mining is. I just kind of picture a bunch of panicked people in a boardroom trying to figure out how not to lose all their money because people are actually caring about climate change. And it seems like the way that they're trying to accomplish this scramble is by framing mining as like an essential, crucial, inevitable element of a green transition, which is absurd for anybody who knows anything about what an open pit mine looks like and the environmental impacts of that. And a lot of mining companies are pivoting really hard away from, I don't know, what we might call like taboo minerals like coal and towards like so-called green minerals like lithium. And, you know, like in and of itself, that's not bad. Like we do need to transition away from coal, but we need to be really careful of the false solutions that are being proposed by segments of our society that are working as hard as possible to maintain the status quo while also somehow satisfying the increasing number of people who are demanding that their investments be green.
Joining me today from Wailu Metals is Luca Giocovazi. Luca, good to meet you. So what commodities are you looking for at the moment? What's in fashion?
Yeah, sure. So I guess going back to, next generation one, next generation of commodity, we sort of start from the top and we go, okay, well, if we're focusing on decarbonising the economy, what trends are playing out in that space? And when you start to unpack an electric vehicle's battery, you quickly learn that nickel's an important component of that battery. And, what constantly comes up is that Eagle's Nest is probably the best undeveloped nickel sulfides deposit globally.
I'm just going to say something that I'm sure your listeners just take for granted, but just to say it out loud, like what they don't want us to know is that at the end of the day, the only thing that will actually prevent us from experiencing the worst impacts of climate change is abolishing capitalism. And like more electric vehicles is not going to do that. I don't know about you, but in my vision of a post-capitalist world, there are no transnational mining corporations. So that's, I think, important to say out loud. Like, built into this assumption is that we could just need to make more certain kinds of cars, but keep everything else the same. And I think even the most centrist scientists these days are acknowledging that, like, that's not real. We need a fundamental shift in the way that our economy runs if we hope to survive, basically. But I do want to say, like, even furthermore, even if we did take seriously the idea that electric vehicles are the solution to climate change, that takes for granted that it's inevitable that we treat Indigenous territories like those in the Ring of Fire basically as sacrifice zones for the public good. And I think any ethical person should look at that idea, like when we say it out loud like that, and realize that that's just morally wrong. So even if electric vehicles were the answer to our problems, I look at the situation and say, not at that cost, right? We got to find another way. So there's a lot of talk right now that's very invested in shaping the narrative in a way that prevents people from looking at the truth of the situation, which is that, like, from top to bottom, the way that our system is built is not sustainable, and we can change everything, but not if we keep listening to the government and mining companies trying to tell us what the pathway forward is.
I guess a term that I've come across a bit recently is critical minerals. Do you want to maybe explain what that is, or how the state and mining companies have been sort of talking about that and some of the discourse around that?
Yeah, and I'm just going to give a big caveat. I'm definitely not an expert on this, just some guy who's also trying to figure it out because it's complicated and new also, and very related to what we were just talking about around green mining and all of these shifts around green technologies. Basically, my understanding is, like, the term critical minerals emerged just very recently to kind of talk about some negotiations that was happening between the US and Canada, where they were trying to come to this shared understanding of what kinds of minerals were really, really important, both to our shared economies and also our shared national security. And so, yeah, there was this kind of like list that everybody was voting on of, like, what are those minerals? What are those materials that are, like, essential to those two kind of features? And that, I mean, obviously there's just like really wonky trade relations stuff that I don't really fully understand, but I personally feel like there's something about the discourse of critical minerals that matters a lot and that feels very intentional. Both because critical, obviously, like, its most straightforward meaning is just, like, important. And so there's something being said here about what matters, what matters in our economy. And the more the state is talking about how much minerals matter, the harder it becomes for the grassroots to criticize, and by criticize I mean attack, these structures that are creating such violence in mining impacted communities. But I also feel like discourse-wise, there's something really, really important to pay attention to in how similar the phrase critical minerals is to critical infrastructure, which is another concept that is used in a security sense. Like in Canada, at least, critical infrastructure is basically like any public infrastructure. When I say public, I don't actually mean public because it can be private too, but any infrastructure that is seen as critical to the functioning of our society, which, like a bridge, for example, is critical infrastructure. If you went and did something to, impact the functioning of a bridge, that could really put people in danger and, would be really bad for a lot of people's safety. But then the definition of critical infrastructure also includes things like pipelines. And that definition also, like I said, with the word critical, like there's just something being said here about what matters and what is essential in our lives, which makes that harder to contest. But it also justifies, basically, like when critical infrastructure comes into the conversation, so does the RCMP. And so it also really justifies the surveillance and the infiltration and like meddling that happens in our movements for any activist group that is trying to organize around these issues. It means that some kinds of activism end up being much more easily framed as terrorism because they're happening around these issues that somebody else decided is critical infrastructure. So like, I'm really just postulating here. I have no evidence to back up the fact that critical minerals and critical infrastructure are being correlated in terms of the mind of the state. But it just makes me think, as somebody who's been paying attention to this stuff for a little while, like it doesn't seem accidental. And can I just say also, like literally the reason why we need minerals for national security is to make weapons. So it's just really interesting to me thinking about pairing these two things together, like what is essential to the economy. You can make an argument that it's important to maintain the health of the economy, but just to pair that so readily with, and also we need to make war machines, and also we need to make so many guns and all the technology that our military needs in order to go all over the world and do its thing. It also feels very intentional to kind of put those two things together as though they're the same and as though they're equally important, and that we need so much mining to make that happen.
I know a lot of our listeners are connected in some way to anarchist or anti-authoritarian social movements or movements against state colonization or struggles for Indigenous self-determination in different ways. I guess what do you feel is important for people to know about the Ring of Fire? What would you hope that people would learn about the project or think about as they're sort of going about their lives and deciding what to put energy into? And
like we're in a I mean, maybe I'm just saying the most obvious thing, but like we're in a really disintegrated time right now, like especially because of the pandemic. And I think most people who have a kind of like revolutionary vision really understand the role that the state plays in exacerbating that and creating that like fragmentation and isolation and the disintegration of our social bonds that so many of us care about and kind of dream of a world that has much more connection and community and like bonds that help us exist outside of the state, or at least in a different relationship to it. And I think this is a really important thing to pay attention to as one of the key strategies that the Ontario government, and to some degree the Canadian government, has employed like throughout the decade that we've been talking about the Ring of Fire and like obviously the entire colonial history of the Canadian project. It's been this divide and rule tactic. So there's many First Nations in Treaty 9, which is the territory that the so-called Ring of Fire is encroaching on. And the last 10 years has basically been this project of systematically creating divides between these communities, all in the name of capitalist profit. And the governments and the corporations involved, they talk as though they have the consent of Indigenous people, but it's just because they're listening only to the handful of communities that are willing to work with them. And that is, as somebody who's been involved with mining struggles for a while, like that's the modus operandi of the mining industry all over the world. It's basically like a playbook at this point. Like, take advantage of the poverty and precarity present in communities that have been plundered and poisoned over hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialism, then present communities with the idea that accepting an extractivist project on their territories will bring endless benefits to their community, which is very appealing when your community has been actively undermined and under-resourced for all of these years, and then call that consent. But we know that's not consent. Like, Indigenous communities should never be placed in a position where they need to choose between the health of their traditional territories and the resources and infrastructure that they should have had access to all along. And that connects to those of us in the South as well, like that legacy of division that has been created between communities on those territories. Like, we read articles about the Ring of Fire and we can think about that something like that's happening in a remote community, but it's not actually, the issue is not remote. Like, the Indigenous people who are standing up against the Ring of Fire know that nobody benefits from the destruction of the peatlands. That if that happens on those particular lands, will release a bunch of stored carbon into the atmosphere and destroy one of the most important natural carbon storage entities that we have right now. This is about us too. And I think that's really important to remember. Like, this struggle, like many other land defense struggles right now, is about all of our futures. And in addition to that, I think we're in a really interesting moment right now. I've been paying attention to the way that mining companies talk for years, and we're starting to see a really drastic change, even just over the last few years, and how mining companies and governments are talking about these issues. And we were talking about this a little bit before. Like, mining companies are talking about something called ESG, which is environment, social, and governance factors. Mining execs are giving land acknowledgements at the beginning of meetings. Like, we're seeing companies like Noront Resources really turn up the volume on their discourse about collaboration with Indigenous partners. And of course, we know the Canadian government is really good at pretending like they care about that stuff too. And that's because of pressure, right? Like, they didn't just do that out of the goodness of their own hearts. They're responding to pressure from people. But then, of course, they're doing it in ways that are all about shifting and wriggling out of accountability and doing everything that they can to use the right words in an attempt to maintain the current balance of power. And so I think we have an opportunity here to refuse to capitulate to that, right? To stay grounded in the power that we have, regardless of the actions of the state. We have an opportunity to say that we're not going to be satisfied with any solution to the climate crisis that keeps this current capitalist colonial system intact, that we won't be satisfied with solutions to climate change that undermine Indigenous sovereignty, that we won't be satisfied with solutions to climate change that treat Indigenous lives and territories like sacrifice zones. I feel like we're just in this moment right now where the pressure is being felt and we shouldn't stop. I think we're actually in a moment in time where we can say that we're not satisfied with anything short of an end to capitalism and land back to Indigenous people. And in order for that message to be truly conveyed, we need to stand beside Indigenous communities who are pushing back against the Ring of Fire, as one of many sites and terrains of struggle in the moment that we find ourselves in right now. So I think it's an opportunity if we can see it that way. And as always, this struggle is connected to all struggles of the same kind on lands across Turtle Island. It's definitely not unique. It's not, and it's not alone, right? It's connected.
Was there anything that I haven't asked you about that you wish that I had or that you wanted to mention?
So one of the central arguments for why we need this extraction to happen in the Ring of Fire is because a lot of people are making the argument that the minerals extracted are going to help us resist climate change, right? By helping us shift away from fuel and coal and all of these other kinds of things that we're so reliant on right now in our current economy. But I think it's important to understand that while there are a lot of different ethical reasons to resist the Ring of Fire, that's also it's just not factual that mining the Ring of Fire will have a positive impact on the environment. Firstly, just because, industrial and especially open pit mining, it's just bad for the environment, and it always has been. And there are obviously ways of mitigating those harms, but within a capitalist framework, profit is always going to come before all else. And one of the things that the mining industry is worst at is long-term accountability around the inevitable environmental consequences of their mines. And we can see a clear example of that in Attawapiskat, actually, which is in the so-called Ring of Fire region with the De Beers mine that promised a lot and totally betrayed that trust, according to many in the community. But beyond the usual environmental impacts, this region has particular climate risks involved because the terrain is full of something called peatlands, which basically act as these incredibly dense and vitally important carbon storage sites. They have basically, over thousands of years, absorbed thousands of years of accumulated carbon. And so if they are destroyed because of mining development, not only are we ditching this important natural entity that is already doing so much work to mitigate the impacts of capitalism, but we're actually releasing thousands of years of stored carbon into the atmosphere. And we just can't afford to do that. Anybody's more interested in peatlands, I'm definitely not an expert, but there's been some really amazing reporting done about it in the Narwhal that you can check out. And the more I read about it, the more I feel convinced that it's actually extremely dangerous to move forward with anything that challenges these important territories.
Thank you again so much for coming on the show. And yeah, it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Same. Thanks for having me and for highlighting this issue. I think it matters a lot, and I hope people will stay in touch.
That brings us to the end of our show. I encourage everyone listening to go to AttawapiskatRiverProtectors.com for more information, or check out the Facebook page, Friends of the Attawapiskat River, to get in touch. Until next time.
The Anarchist Radio Berlin.
From across the pond.
So it's the Anarchist Radio Berlin.
With audios in English, Spanish and German.
And please,
don't mention the war.
You can find us at channelzeronetwork.com and aradio-berlin.org.